Well, good afternoon, everybody. We've got 30 minutes to cover a lot of ground, so I'm going to jump right in. We've had the introductions for both of us, but I'm going to start by asking Alistair some questions. And we want to get back to basics just a little bit. Compliance and quality control organizations, whether they're inside the firm or a third-party vendor, have traditionally been involved with gathering and interpreting regulatory guidelines, manually reviewing customer interactions or firm activities, and driving best practices for both compliance and quality control. Everybody knows that. As you and I have talked, it's still pretty early days for technology to really facilitate and assist with those tasks. Notwithstanding that, can you give us a roadmap of how you look at the way technology is now assisting with those tasks, and what's your vision for redefining the man-machine partnership in establishing a compliance framework? And will that partnership change the way we think about all these processes from a business perspective and from a risk management perspective?
That's perfect. We can have one question for 30 minutes.
We got more.
Yeah, let me start a little bit. So we kind of decided to get deeply engaged in sort of this whole regulatory compliance space, largely from speaking to our clients who, we're really clear that despite all the money being spent, despite the incredible numbers of people being deployed, their current view was the effectiveness, much less the efficiency of what they were doing for regulatory compliance, was nowhere near what they wanted it to be, despite a lot of efforts. So we kind of break the problem into sort of two or three parts. The first is on the front end. You're exactly right. The state of the art in many organizations is an incredibly manual process to understand regulations, determine obligations, and then ultimately kind of map them into some degree of a control point and control plan. And a lot of the state of the art of that is maybe a GRC system, but more likely a spreadsheet. So when we've worked with Promontory, who many of you may know, one of the sort of leading advisory firms in regulatory compliance, when we kind of go back and look at when issues arise, a lot of that can be traced back to people not having a clear understanding of what exactly was the obligation and the control point. I mean, real basics. So we think that process needs to be fundamentally, I would say, enhanced and automated in a number of ways. So we're working through now, can we use AI and cognitive to essentially teach the machine to read and understand regulation, and provide the people that are choosing the obligations out of those regulations with essentially an AI assist to understand which of those potential obligations would they accept, and to do sort of that work of getting them automatically classified against a jurisdiction or a line of business, that kind of thing, which is really helpful in sort of the first round of that. But from a roadmap perspective and from what clients are pushing us on is, how do you then turn that into a continuous scanning of the horizon, so that as regulations change or business products change or investments in certain areas change, how can you sort of have a much more dynamic understanding of what the obligations are and what kind of control or compliance infrastructure.
So ultimately maybe even a real-time perspective on some of these.
Yeah, and that's really what people are looking for. So the perspective is not so much can we get it right once, the perspective is it is so dynamic, how do we know that it's always right, and sort of can we start to essentially get to an automated and assistance view of given the current business environment or a change, are we where are we against obligations and compliance control points. So that's kind of one piece of it, and there's an awful lot there. It might be a good point to just interject. We got a pretty strong point of view that says ultimately we started applying a lot of our cognitive capability, AI capability in healthcare, and if you just bear with me for the parallel, in that case you're very much trying to help a doctor, understand all the medical trials, understand patient records, but ultimately kind of distill that into an assistant that can help them make a better decision with some degree of confidence. And that's exactly how we think AI and some of these tools will be applied in regulatory compliance. You're not going to completely automate it and take the experts out. You're going to try to give them a much better horizon scan, help them make better decisions, and as they make decisions, have the system learn. So you're very much trying to make a man plus machine kind of environment. So that's on the front end, and then we can talk more about it, but we also think that some of the underlying control systems that have to match up to whatever obligations you're trying to comply with. Many of those control systems use relatively limited amounts of data. They focus mostly on structured data. They rely heavily on a lot of human intervention to kind of investigate highly overwhelmed resources. So we think in numbers of areas, whether it be conduct surveillance, financial crime, compensation management. I mean, there's many areas that those underlying control systems will also now start to be able to use many more types of data, have models that start to learn about what a particular behavior or outcome or problem is, and ultimately start to connect back to a compliance system in real time. So eventually, what I think people would like, is particularly at a board or a board of directors level, is a real-time answer that could be based in data and confidence. What are we obligated to do, and where are we right now in terms of a degree of confidence in terms of our compliance? Which seems like a really simple question, but is not the state of the art in many places.
Hard to do. So in that regard, obviously different businesses have different business models, different risk tolerances, different risk profiles. The last thing you want is a one-size-fits-all approach to people. How have you seen customers use analytics to develop and customize their risk tolerances and profiles, and to develop and fine-tune what they're doing with their compliance regimes that's consistent with their overall business strategy, including perhaps risk management?
So, I mean, where we're finding a lot of the energy right now is being driven, I think, by a lot of the current issues financial institutions are under great pressure on. Probably the most energetic space right now would go under the umbrella of financial crime. Now, which caused a little bit of a kerfuffle with our marketing team when we said we were going to put a financial crimes unit together, but it mapped to client organizations. So a couple of examples. Tremendous pressure globally on for example, the AML process be enhanced with more data. I mean, right now, most people sort of deal with a transaction monitoring system and all the things that are difficult with that, including a high false positive rate. So a lot of energy globally to say, can we apply new forms of analytics? Can we start to look at unstructured information? Can we start to learn from case management, the decisions made to deal with that in sort of an immediate way, and then longer term, can we start to apply analytics on better risk management of who we're onboarding? Are there continuous scanning of who that client is, feeding that? So AML is a big area where people are looking at improvement. The other that has become a very topical issue globally has been understanding conduct risk in various parts of the organization. When we started down the journey, a lot of this work was largely kind of contained to a trading floor, where surveillance and having to deal with potential, sort of manipulation and bad behavior has always been an issue. And certainly there's some better ways to do that. But that whole issue of basic conduct right down to the front level of the organization has become a critical topic because it seems to be kind of the point, the tip of the arrow in terms of where some of these larger issues have happened. So, how do you have a better understanding of what employees are saying to clients? How do you use non-traditional data sources to look for problems, so customer complaint databases or email communications, all those sorts of things, to actually get a better sense of risk profile in terms of what's going on at the very front line of that organization, has become an amazingly important topic at almost every board level.
Well, to do all this, obviously, and you mentioned it earlier, data are really important. And as the compliance process becomes more automated, it's pretty clear that you're going to need high quality, timely, and fit for purpose data that are very granular. So, that means a huge volume of data. Do the firms you work with recognize that? Are they taking appropriate steps really to satisfy those requirements? And how do they coordinate the chief data officer and the chief compliance officer jobs in that regard?
So the very best firms are using, you're exactly right. So it's two things. It's more data, but it's also more types of data. So a lot of what I think will help in the compliance space is not just structured data. I mean, that's pretty well known for financial risk and market liquidity risk, that kind of stuff. Where the real advantages is more data, but also getting to broader sets of unstructured data.
Right.
The very best organizations I've seen are using this as an opportunity to essentially join forces and use compliance as a leverage to bring together, the customer data lake they've always wanted, or, a set of cross-sell analytics or business analytics. Because in many ways, the integrated data lake around customer information that you might use for revenue generation is exactly the same data that you maybe want to use for a better understanding of know your client.
Right.
So it's a great opportunity for people to kind of bring together data projects across the whole organization. Not everybody's at that stage, but in many cases, it's proved to be the investment catalyst on both sides. Yeah, and it really, and with unstructured data architectures and all that, it's become a lot faster. The step after that I think gets unique to compliance is, one, it's not just about the data. It starts to become about trained analytic models of lots of different analytic types. That requires experimentation and work to determine, for example, is a complaint a legitimate complaint because somebody didn't like the service fee, or is it an indication of a potential abuse problem? And that's a whole sort of experimentation on building models around machine learning, and sort of the second step.
Right. Okay. Well, analytics are being used to solve all kinds of business problems as they become much more accessible and available. In addition to regulatory compliance, are you seeing customers use these solutions in ways that are generating ROI, such as customer experience, insights, kind of the integration that you were alluding to just a moment ago?
Sure. I mean, so the underlying use for a lot of analytics has always been, can you do better customer segmentation? Can you do life event identification? Putting the right offer in the right channel. So for sure, that's part of it. We're also seeing it being used around compensation management, for example. So, tied closely to some of these conduct issues have been compensation and incentive schemes. So can you start to look and be a lot more real time about knowing what your compensation model is and what's happening with it? Are there changes in that model? So absolutely.
Okay. Well, obviously, everybody reads the newspapers, and data privacy, data security, and data consent are pretty much in the news. People are starting to understand, some of the implications of how data should and probably should not be used.
Yep.
I guess the question is, can analytic solutions, including machine learning, AI, whatever, and these cognitive applications be used to help navigate that balance and achieve the balance between business strategy and those considerations?
So this is a really important area, and I think it gets to, the tools can be used in lots of different ways. And all sorts of different firms have kind of different perspectives on it. I think a lot of this starts with, a thoughtful and clearly kind of articulated policy at a number of levels to be able to do this well. So, clarity on consent about, what data are you going to collect, and what are you going to do with it, and do the people involved know about it, and are they, kind of informed? And, this is going to cross a lot of boundaries. I mean, sort of one end is going to be, what do you do with customer data? And how do you sort of comply with both laws and, whatever you set up as your policy as an organization? But it's also going to start to apply to people inside the organization. That gets maybe a little less tricky because, some roles, are required to be surveilled. So, some of the tools being used to look for potential conduct abuse, are absolutely invasive to information that you're surveilling in terms of internal systems. So thoughtfulness about that is going to be really, really important. And there's lots of technology tools to sort of, mask data and deal with PII, and all of that can be thought through. But I really think the core of it is a thoughtful policy that kind of goes through the organization, and how you sort of support that. The second piece that I think is going to start to become very interesting is at the root of what we talk about with machine learning and AI and all this kind of stuff are algorithms that are essentially modifying themselves as they learn. And that can be really powerful. It can deliver great results. But I think there's going to be a really needed conversation about how do you approach the use of those algorithms, and are those algorithms understandable? So if you get to the point that the machine learning system is so complicated that no human can kind of understand how those decisions are getting made, that is not a good outcome. That'll be like, many of the fraud systems we have today are like that. They're just a black box. And I think that opens up a whole other set of exposures in terms of, do you have bias in your algorithms? Do you have risk in your algorithms you don't know about? Do you have a business process you ultimately don't understand? So I think the other part of this that's going to be so important is understandable algorithms, interaction systems with those algorithms that present information in a way that an expert can understand and make a decision, the ability to go back and look at how those algorithms are evolving. So I think data privacy is core, but I think closely associated with that as we get into some of these tools is going to be how do you actually understand and make sure you're in control of some of the systems that are assisting your people.
All right. Well, let's look a little bit ahead. As we look back 5 years ago, even 1 year ago, much of what we're talking about wasn't in the marketplace or on the horizon. And it's pretty clear that rapid change is on the horizon. I'm actually thinking about putting together a RegTech course and to teach it. And I can guarantee you that what the course is going to look like 6 months from now is not what I would say it's going to be today. So that's just an example. So as we look ahead, where do you see the analytics either for regulatory compliance or for other purposes going in the next, well, I hesitate to say 5 years. How about 1 to 5 years? What cool stuff are you guys working on right now?
So I think one thing I would say before we worry about 5 to 10 years, I think a lot of the stuff that we're embarking on now is new. And I think we're at the early state of deploying new systems like this. So whether it's sort of machines being able to read and understand regulation, or being able to sort of look in real time at broad sets of information to look for patterns of abuse, that's going to evolve. I think it's going to evolve the same way analytics, I think, has generally evolved in other use cases like customer. It's going to evolve in high value pockets. And the models are going to get better, and we're going to learn. So it's not going to magically come out as one big platform. We're going to go through learning in lots of different areas and build up the models. And I think that will legitimately take easily in your 1 to 5 years to work its way through. I think some of the improvements that will go on in the kind of the cool stuff. I think the understanding of the understanding of natural language in all its forms in very close to real time to understand very closely what's going on in a process is moving at incredible paces. We've just gone into an early implementation with a European bank where we're listening to the trading floor in real time, kind of converting into text and applying analytics around that to look for patterns of abuse. And that whole analytic pattern is going well beyond sort of lexicon kind of things, listening for phrases, and much more sophisticated in terms of applying kind of baseline behavioral analytics to say, is that an abnormal pattern? And doing it in very close to real time. And I think we're going to have that ability to look across lots of different use cases and in a lot faster way, kind of look for things that are abnormal. And I think that's I think one of the things we're learning through the analytics is there isn't a black and white. There's not a yes or no on a lot of these cases. What you're trying to do is find early signal abnormal, elevated up so that scarce resources can be deployed to look at it, and you get those early signals. So I think the evolution of those models is going to continue, and all of that gets powered by better AI and faster compute. I think one of the things in financial risk that's going to be really interesting is we are probably, so outside of your 5-year window, we are probably, depending on which researcher I believe, somewhere between 4 and 8 years away from usable quantum computing, which is just step orders magnitude in terms of compute power. I think
Alistair, tell us what quantum computing is.
So all computing we've done, from the start of computing is based on only kind of 2 states, right? A 0 or a 1, and then all the things that kind of happen with that in terms of the core architecture of the computer. When you can start to store the information in a quantum environment, and the technology is pretty exciting, you basically have an infinite number of states for any one of those bits of information, which means the ability to run compute and process things just goes exponentially high. And it's been, it's been a research dream for a long time, but it's pretty close to being real. Practical implications of that kind of compute power being available, certainly it's going to hit the cyber world because, number one up for this kind of stuff is going to be encryption, and making sure that sort of encryption that can deal with today's processing power stays secure with, sort of an entirely different way of going about getting at it. From a regulatory perspective, I think it's going to have profound, and sort of the early experiments we're doing are, financial risk models. So when you have, that much compute power, it'll be really, I think, well suited to financial risk calculations, which will have the ability, I think, to deliver potentially more safety, look at more data, probably look at more systemic risk, and do things in periods of time that we could never imagine, which will probably give people the ability to think about new services, new offerings, new ways of allocating capital. So I think that'll be an interesting one that we're not ready for.
Sounds like a brave new world to me.
It will be exciting. It will be exciting, but I mean the front wave of that is going to be people having to fundamentally, and we're helping people now start to think through what does encryption and security look like in a world where computing power just went up that much.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. We still have a few minutes left. So what do you think we missed in our conversation?
I think the one thing that always gets missed when we start talking about technology and analytics is culture. And when we brought Promontory and IBM together, I think people thought that maybe that was going to be, kind of a really interesting / kind of weird culture mix, because Promontory has got, a lot of folks that came out of deep regulatory backgrounds, and, we come at it from a technology perspective, and nothing there could have been further from the truth. I mean, the whole regulatory community has tremendous interest, and I would say passion for how do we apply technology to get more trust and security in the financial system. And it pervades the people at Promontory and almost every regulator we've worked with. But the reality, I think when we're applying new technologies, it's going to require experimentation. Some of this stuff is new. You're trying to train models on data that's scarce. You're looking to get into processes that are heavily regulated. So when you're applying analytics to almost any process, you go from this world of, a transaction sort of, when you're monitoring, dealing with transactions, there's certainty. There's a yes, there's no, it's binary. Anything with applied analytics moves you instantly into this world of, probability and confidence levels and things that are maybe less deterministic. Now, it's not that the other systems are better, it's just that they feel more deterministic. And you also have systems that have been in place for a long time, that are understood, that have been through regulatory certification, so changing them is a big deal. I think one of the things we all need to be really good at is conducting managed experiments and getting to this culture of, how do you deal with probability and confidence levels. So some of the regulators are working on sandboxing. Some of the regulators in Singapore are starting to galvanize the industry around new approaches, for example, around identity. I think some institutions may want to get together and share information over time, so there's going to be that avenue to flow. But all of that kind of gets to a culture that is both rigorous from a compliance perspective, but open to inserting, well-managed experiments into that process to make the whole thing come up. And I think, the stakeholders there are clearly going to be, obviously, the institutions themselves. But everything I've seen globally says regulators want to be part of that process. So I think if we can drive that culture of experimentation, it's a missing piece.
And one aspect of that was discussed actually on an earlier panel is, we shouldn't be afraid to fail. Not fail in a fatal way, but we can make mistakes, we can do them in a controlled way so that we can learn from those mistakes and move on. And that's part of the experimentation process.
Exactly. It's this whole notion of, what's the purpose of the experiment? So if we're trying to train a model, can we prove the model's better or not better? Can we run multiple models? So it's not just, it's not kids running with scissors. It's managed analytic experiments to see if we can get a lift. And absolutely.
Yeah. And as you indicated a moment ago, the man-machine interface, I think, can apply not just at the firm level. It can apply also for the regulators themselves. So the regulators can learn from these experiments about what works, what doesn't, how to make regulation more effective, efficient, and not one size fits all.
Yeah, I think that'll be the other outcome. I think a lot of the data from these systems will actually give people insights to what's really going on across the financial services industry or any industry that's dealing with compliance. But that data becomes a resource for regulatory optimization, process optimization. I mean, it becomes a real resource, to help optimize and get to more effective regulation and policy. So I think the regulators are a big part of the ecosystem and stakeholders in this.
Great. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.